I had exactly $11,942 left in my personal checking account when my mother called me selfish for refusing to save her a third time. 2 weeks earlier, I had been on a magnesium drip after an emergency delivery at Presbyterian Hospital in Charlotte while both of my parents sat under string lights at a black tie donor gala pretending they had no idea their daughter was in surgery. By the time I was stable enough to look at my phone, I had 6 unanswered calls to them, 11 red texts, and a padded envelope on my kitchen island containing a silver USB drive I did not recognize. I also had one attorney telling me there was a fraud carve-out in my grandfather's trust that could unwind everything my parents thought they controlled. I dropped my water glass that night and just stared at the floor for a second before I bent down to clean it up. Let me take you back. My name is Olivia Hart. I was 37 then, a labor and delivery charge nurse in Charlotte, North Carolina. I was the daughter people called competent when what they really meant was convenient. My younger brother Mason was 33, charming in the lazy way some men are charming because everyone around them keeps doing the hard parts for them. My parents, Richard and Elaine Hart, had spent years building a public brand around faith, philanthropy, and family. They chaired hospital fundraisers, sponsored church banquets, and posted polished photos under captions about gratitude and legacy. In those photos, Mason was always front and center. I was usually the person behind the camera or the person they cropped in at the edge. When my husband Nate and I finally got pregnant after 3 rounds of IVF, my mother said, "That's good news, Liv. Just don't overdo it with your schedule." For minutes later, she changed the subject to Mason's condo search. When Mason announced that his girlfriend was expecting, my parents rented a private room at the Duke Mansion for brunch, ordered custom cookies, and hired a photographer. My mother cried into a linen napkin and told everyone, "I've waited so long for this." I was already 14 weeks pregnant, standing 6 feet away, holding a glass of sparkling water and pretending I had suddenly become very interested in the floral arrangement. Those things sound small when you say them out loud. That is part of why families like mine get away with it for so long. None of it looks dramatic in isolation. It is only when you line the incidents up, one after another, that the shape becomes impossible to miss. The first scar I can point to happened when I was 17 and Mason was 13. He forgot a major history project, panicked the morning it was due, and my mother came into my room before sunrise holding his crumpled rubric. "You're faster at this stuff," she said. "He gets overwhelmed." I stayed up rewriting his presentation while he slept. He got an A. At dinner that night, my father lifted his glass and said, "That's my boy." He looked right through me when he said it. The second was the summer I was 29, a year after my grandmother died. My parents were trying to keep up appearances after my father's commercial real estate deal went bad. I discovered a county notice taped to their side gate, delinquent property taxes on a parcel they had inherited from my grandfather. I took a half day off, met with their accountant, and realized they were also behind on a bridge loan tied to my father's failed development LLC. I spent 3 weeks negotiating a payment plan and fronted $46,800 from my savings to stop a foreclosure filing while they got things sorted. My mother hugged me with one arm and said, "Please don't mention this to Mason. He worries." Later that month, at church, I heard her tell a friend, "Our advisor helped us navigate a temporary cash flow issue." I stood there holding a tray of lemon bars like a catering assistant at my own family's lie. I wish I could say I learned then. I did not. My flaw was simple and expensive. I believed if I kept enough things from breaking, eventually somebody would notice the hands doing the holding. By the time I was 36 weeks pregnant, I was tired in the deep way that starts behind your eyes. Nate had a regional sales conference in Asheville the weekend before our planned induction window. He asked twice if he should cancel. I said no. I am still angry at myself for how automatic that answer was. I had spent so many years minimizing my own needs that I heard warning signs in my own body and translated them into inconvenience. Saturday morning, I woke with a headache that felt wrong. Not bad. Wrong. Sharp light at the edges of my vision. Pressure in my chest. A blood pressure reading at home that made my stomach drop. I called Nate first. Then I drove myself to Presbyterian because he was 2.5 hours west on I-40 and I did not have time to wait. Triage moved fast. The nurse took one look at the monitor, repeated my pressure out loud, and called for the attending. Labs came back ugly. Severe preeclampsia, concern for HELLP, immediate delivery. I knew enough medicine to understand what was happening, which in some ways made it worse. At 9:11 a.m., within 4 in my arm and monitors clipping warnings into the room, I called my mother. "Mom," I said, crying and not bothering to hide it, I'm at Presbyterian. "My blood pressure is critical. They're talking about delivering today. I need you here." There was a pause, then the sound of silverware and voices in the background. "Oh, honey," she said lightly, "we're already downtown." "For what?" "The Hartwell Foundation Gala setup. Your father is doing final walkthroughs and I'm at hair and makeup at the hotel. Tonight is a big night." "Mom, I'm not asking you to come to dinner. They're saying emergency delivery." "I'm scared." She sighed. An actual sigh. "Can Nate's mother come?" "She lives in Winston-Salem." "Well, call her too. You know how dramatic hospitals can be before a birth. Text me when the baby is here." Then she hung up. I stared at the screen for a second because the body sometimes delays comprehension out of mercy. I called my father at 9:16. No answer. I texted both of them between 9:18 and 11:02. "They're taking me for surgery. This is serious. Please answer. I need someone here before Nate gets back. I'm scared." Every message showed red. At 10:03, my mother posted an Instagram story from a ballroom mirror at the Grand Bohemian Hotel, emerald gown, makeup chair, captioned "Ready to celebrate generosity tonight." At 10:27, my father reposted a stage photo, proud of what this foundation is building for Charlotte families. At 11:14, I was wheeled toward the OR. My daughter, Clara, was born that afternoon by emergency C-section. She cried almost immediately. I remember that sound more clearly than anything else. Then came a blur of blood pressure alarms, medication, and the sensation that everyone around me was speaking calmly on purpose. Complications followed. More bleeding than expected. A second procedure. Recovery that did not feel like recovery so much as surviving minute by minute until my body agreed to stay. Nate made it in time to see me after the second procedure, face gray with fear. His mother, Joanne, arrived less than 90 minutes later with a tote bag, a phone charger, and the kind of steady presence that makes a room feel less frightening. My parents visited the next day for 28 minutes. I know because I looked at the clock when they came in and again when they left. My mother held Clara for one photo. My father asked, "Everything under control now?" My mother mentioned the gala 3 times in those 28 minutes. We had nearly 400 donors. The auction did beautifully. Mason emceed one of the segments and was hilarious. Then, while I was still attached to a blood pressure cuff, she said, "We really need one full family portrait soon. It will look odd if Clara is missing from our annual donor letter." That was the moment something in me went quiet. Not angry, not shuddered. Quiet. I put the phone face down. 3 days later, while I was home trying to learn my daughter's breathing patterns and my own limits, a padded envelope appeared on our front porch. No return address. Inside was a silver USB drive and a folded note on plain paper. "You were never supposed to be cut out. Check the metadata. Start with the second folder." No signature. Nate wanted to call the police immediately. I wanted to understand what I was holding before I did anything loud. He plugged the drive into an old laptop we kept for travel. There were 3 folders: Gala, Trust, and Audio. The first folder contained still images from the ballroom's internal event system and copies of social media posts I had already seen. The second folder changed everything. Inside Trust were scanned PDFs, an irrevocable trust created by my grandfather before his death, amendments, board minutes from the Hartwell Foundation, and one unsigned draft memorandum from a law office downtown. My grandfather had not left my parents unrestricted control of the family properties the way they always implied. He had placed 2 commercial parcels and 1 lake house into an irrevocable trust with income distributions tied to caregiving benchmarks for lineal descendants and a fraud carve-out that triggered review if any trustee knowingly made false family dependency declarations for financial advantage. At first, that sounded dry enough to be harmless. Then Nate and I kept reading. 6 months before my delivery, my parents had petitioned for increased trustee compensation and discretionary housing support for Mason, describing him in foundation-related paperwork as the primary family caregiver and only child materially involved in elder support and intergenerational oversight. Only child. I read that phrase twice. Then I opened another PDF and found attached reimbursement requests, donor presentations, and a draft for a legacy campaign brochure that referred to Mason as the sole next-generation steward of the Hartwell family mission. The trust also contained a canary clause. If any trustee submitted materially false dependency or lineage representations in relation to distributions, any affected beneficiary could compel a forensic accounting and temporary asset restrictions pending review. I knew just enough law to know I needed someone who knew the rest. That afternoon, I received a call from a man named Daniel Keene, an estate litigation attorney whose name was on one of the scanned drafts. He said, "Mrs. Hart, I can't discuss a former consult in detail over the phone. But if you have documents bearing my firm's footer and you believe you were omitted or misrepresented in trust materials, you need counsel today." "Why are you calling me?" I asked. A pause. "Because someone who cares about the truth wanted you to have the right number." We met Monday morning. I brought the USB drive, my hospital records, screenshots of my unanswered texts, the county tax wire from years earlier, and every document I had saved from my parents' previous financial crisis, because by then I no longer believed in isolated incidents. Daniel read for 45 minutes without much expression. Then he looked up and said, "If these are authentic, your parents did two separate things. One is morally awful but not illegal. They ignored you during a medical emergency. The other may be legally actionable. They appear to have made false representations to obtain trust-related benefits and shape foundation control. If you miss this, you lose everything." I remember the exact stillness in the room after he said it. He explained the deadline. The annual trustee review hearing was in 9 days. If no objection was filed before then, the latest compensation schedule and governance recommendations would become much harder to unwind. He wanted a petition, affidavit, and motion for temporary restrictions filed before close of business Thursday. He also wanted to verify the documents through metadata and third-party sources. "This isn't revenge," he said once we were outlining next steps. "This is justice." Then we worked. That week felt less like living and more like assembling a machine around the truth. Daniel's forensic consultant verified the PDF's creation history and cross-matched embedded metadata against office systems and timestamps. The gala photos on the USB were more useful than I first understood. Ballroom access logs and event still stamped my parents' locations at the exact times my messages to them were read. Security footage from the hotel's service corridor showed my father checking his phone at 9:21 a.m., looking directly at the screen, and slipping it back into his jacket while discussing floral placement. My mother's story draft metadata placed her in a makeup suite at 10:04 a.m., 2 minutes after reading the text that said, "They're taking me to surgery." The ally turned out to be someone I never would have guessed. Not a nurse. Not a cousin. Not one of my mother's humiliated church friends. It was Pastor Adrian Wells. He had served on the Hartwell Foundation board in an advisory role for years. What I did not know is that before seminary, he had practiced compliance law. He requested a private meeting with Daniel after seeing portions of the documents. Then he quietly produced board packets, email headers, and an internal memo raising concerns that Mason's only child language was inaccurate and presented unnecessary legal exposure. The memo had been ignored. Pastor Wells had saved copies because, in his words, I had begun to suspect image was outrunning integrity. I sat there holding Clara's diaper bag while a pastor explained email retention policy and chain of custody to my attorney. Life is strange that way. My parents escalated exactly as people like them often do once they sense control slipping. My mother called in tears first. "I don't know what fantasy someone has filled your head with," she said, "but you are postpartum and vulnerable and not thinking clearly." My father tried anger. "You are not dragging this family through legal mud because your feelings are hurt over one difficult weekend." "One difficult weekend," I repeated. Then silence. Then I said, "You filed documents calling Mason your only child." "That is not what that meant." "It is literally what it says." He switched tactics. Those were draft materials. They were attached to compensation requests. That was the first time he hung up on me. By Friday, they were trying humiliation. My mother texted, "You always had a talent for making yourself the victim. Do not embarrass us at the gala." I read that while pumping milk at 2 a.m. in my kitchen. I almost answered too quickly. That was my setback. Pain still has a voice, and mine wanted to say everything at once. Daniel stopped me when I forwarded the draft. "Do not litigate by text," he said. "We use filings, not feelings." So I deleted my reply. Then I waited. The gala itself had been rescheduled as a celebration dinner tied to the Foundation's Legacy campaign launch, still at the Grand Bohemian, still full of donors, pastors, board members, and local press. My parents assumed the room was theirs because rooms like that had always been theirs. They did not know Daniel had already filed the petition for forensic accounting, injunction on discretionary distributions, and trustee review. They did not know Pastor Wells had called an emergency board discussion immediately before the donor presentation. They did not know the hotel's legal department had preserved internal footage in response to a records request. I did not attend in person at first. I was 3 weeks postpartum, exhausted, and not interested in turning myself into spectacle. Daniel went. Pastor Wells went. So did a court reporter retained for an adjacent board proceeding. Nate stayed home with Clara while I watched a private live feed from Daniel's tablet once the board session began behind closed doors. Small reveal first. Daniel distributed a comparison packet showing the trust language beside my birth certificate, my grandfather's beneficiary letter, and foundation reimbursement documents identifying Mason as the only child materially involved in family support. He asked whether the board had reviewed the accuracy of that phrasing before approving compensation recommendations. Several members had not. Then the bigger reveal. Pastor Wells produced the internal memo he had written months earlier cautioning that the wording was false and risky. He read one sentence aloud: "Any claim minimizing or erasing Ms. Olivia Hart's documented caregiving and financial support could trigger beneficiary challenge under Section 8 fraud review provisions." My mother apparently went white at that point. Daniel told me later she reached for water and missed the glass. Then the nuclear one. The ballroom screen, intended for a donor sizzle reel, displayed stills from the preserved hotel footage and metadata summaries. No dramatic music. No edited montage. Just timestamps. 9:18 a.m., read text. 9:21 a.m., Richard Hart looking at his phone in the service corridor. 10:02 a.m., read text. 10:04 a.m., Elaine Hart uploading a styling photo. 11:11 a.m., read text. They're taking me now. 11:14 a.m., gala seating diagram reviewed by both trustees. Dramatic irony did the rest. The room was full of people who had heard my parents talk for years about family-first values and sacrificial love. No one needed a speech. They only needed the order of events. My mother said, "This is a private family matter." Pastor Wells answered, very calmly, "Not once trust filings and charitable governance rely on false family representations. Then it becomes a fiduciary matter." My father stood and said the footage proved nothing except that they had phones in their hands. Daniel said, "Correct." Combined with the read receipts, the declarations, the reimbursement requests, and the ignored warning memo, it proves enough to require court review. I heard a chair scrape hard across the floor through the tablet audio. 2 days later, we were in Mecklenburg County Superior Court on the emergency motions. My parents had retained counsel by then, but late panic is a poor substitute for preparation. The petition alleged false beneficiary representations, improper trustee compensation, and misuse of foundation-related family status claims to influence control and distributions. It requested a forensic audit, temporary asset freeze on discretionary trust outflows, and suspension of my parents' unilateral trustee authority pending full review. The courtroom went silent when Daniel entered the hotel timestamp exhibits and the prior financial transfer records showing I had bailed them out years earlier while being omitted from their caregiving narrative. He did not overplay them. He did not need to. He simply established pattern, motive, and material falsity. My mother cried once on the stand. My father did not. He went with offended dignity instead. Their attorney argued the only child phrasing was shorthand in draft materials and that no malicious intent existed. The judge asked, then why was a written warning about the inaccuracy ignored? No one had a satisfying answer. When questioned about my prior support, my father said, Olivia has always helped voluntarily. Daniel replied, voluntary support from a living daughter is not a legal basis for erasing her existence in fiduciary documents. The judge granted temporary relief that afternoon. Suspension of the contested compensation increases, temporary freeze on certain discretionary trust distributions, appointment of a neutral fiduciary reviewer, and preservation orders for foundation and trustee communications. A full forensic accounting followed. That accounting uncovered more than I had known to look for. Mason had received subsidized housing support through trust-related channels justified by narratives of family burden sharing that omitted me entirely. Foundation funds had not been directly stolen, but governance recommendations were clearly shaped by a false succession story. Dutiful son, absent daughter, smooth handoff. The documents made it look inevitable. Paper can do terrible things when people respect it more than truth. The official consequences came in layers over the next 5 months. My parents resigned from trustee positions before the final hearing concluded. The court approved a settlement requiring reimbursement of improperly supported discretionary payments, independent oversight of remaining trust assets, and a revised beneficiary acknowledgement record that included me formally. The Hartwell Foundation Board restructured, adopted conflict of interest controls, and quietly removed both of my parents from public-facing leadership. Mason lost the condo subsidy and, with it, a great deal of his confidence. He sent me one long text about betrayal, family loyalty, and misunderstanding. I responded with my attorney copied and exactly 11 words. Please direct all questions regarding trust matters to counsel. Nothing personal. That was not true, of course. It was deeply personal. But it was also clean. My mother wanted one last private meeting before the settlement was signed. We met in Daniel's conference room because I had learned settings matter. She looked smaller without an audience. I made mistakes, she said. But you let strangers judge us. I filed facts, I said. You enjoyed this. No, I said. I survived it. Then she asked the question I think she had been asking all along, just in different clothes. How do I fix this? I looked at the glass wall behind her for a second, at my reflection holding a folder on my lap. You start by telling the truth without needing credit for it, I said. And you stop asking me to carry your consequences. She cried quietly. I did not. There was no dramatic apology. No miraculous insight. Some people do not transform under exposure. They simply become less able to hide. 1 year later, Clara was walking with the wide, determined steps of a child who trusted the floor. I was back at work 3 days a week in a maternal safety role I had moved into after deciding I wanted fewer night shifts and more time home. Nate built a vegetable bed in the backyard. Joanne still came on Thursdays with soup in mismatched containers. Pastor Wells sent us a Christmas card with a note that said, integrity usually costs something up front and saves something bigger later. The legal pieces settled into their adult forms. The trust remained intact under independent oversight. A corrected beneficiary schedule restored what had been strategically minimized. My parents sold the lake house they had once treated like a symbol and used part of the proceeds to satisfy settlement obligations. No one went to jail. No one was ruined beyond repair. That mattered to me. I did not want destruction. I wanted proportion. My relationship with them became factual, limited, and quiet. Birthdays received cards. Major health updates were acknowledged. There were no more emergency rescues, no more silent bailouts, no more pretending that my usefulness was the same thing as love. Mason drifted in and out of contact depending on whether he needed something, which made the answer easy. The most surprising part was what replaced the old pattern. Not revenge. Space. Space is underrated. Once I stopped pouring myself into people who treated me like infrastructure, I had more of myself for the ones who showed up voluntarily. For Nate. For Clara. For friends who brought groceries without being asked. For the new mothers at the hospital who needed one calm face in a frightening room. For me, sometimes people ask whether it hurt to take legal action against my own family. It did. But pain and clarity can exist together. Boundaries are not cruelty. Documentation is not disloyalty. And silence is not always peace. Sometimes it is just unpaid labor in a nicer outfit. I used to think love meant anticipating everyone else's collapse and standing under the falling pieces. Now I think love looks a lot more like honesty, reciprocity, and people who come when you call. If you have ever had to stop being useful before anyone would see you as human, I want to know what boundary changed your life. And if stories about quiet evidence, earned justice, and rebuilding from the truth speak to you, subscribe and stay with me.